When the billionaire CEO asked Marcus Chun for financial advice as a joke, she expected him to play along and disappear. Instead, he sat down at her table and told her exactly why her $8 billion empire was collapsing. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The laughter started before Marcus Chun even reached the doorway of the executive conference room. It's the kind of laughter that comes easy to men who've never known want, never felt the cold grip of an empty bank account or the hollow ache of watching their children go to bed hungry. Rich, performative laughter that echoed off the floor to ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, 47 stories above the streets where real life happened. Marcus paused just outside the door, his cleaning cart a familiar weight against his calloused hands. He'd learned long ago that invisibility was a janitor's greatest asset in these gleaming corporate towers. You pushed your cart, you emptied the trash, you wiped down the surfaces, and you disappeared into the background like smoke. The executives talked freely around him as if he were a piece of furniture, sharing secrets and strategies they'd never dare speak in front of anyone who mattered. But tonight was different. Tonight, they wanted him to be seen. Catherine Whitmore, the CEO of Whitmore Financial Holdings, sat at the head of the massive mahogany table, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around a glass of 30-year-old scotch. She was everything the business magazine said she was. Sharp, ruthless, brilliant. At 42, she'd built a financial empire worth $8 billion. Started from a trust fund and an Ivy League education that opened every door before she even had to knock. Her ash blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun that somehow managed to look both elegant and intimidating. Her steel gray suit probably cost more than Marcus made in 6 months. Around her sat the usual collection of vice presidents, senior partners, and board members. Men, mostly in their tailored suits and Italian leather shoes. Their faces flushed with expensive alcohol and the particular arrogance that comes from never having been told no. Marcus recognized most of them. Richard Hastings from acquisitions, always the first to make a crude joke. David Park from international operations, who left his empty coffee cups in places that forced Marcus to stretch and strain to reach them. Jonathan Webb, the CFO, whose desk was always covered in takeout containers that had been left to rot. Catherine's voice cut through the laughter like a blade. "Marcus, come in. Don't be shy. We've been waiting for you." There was something predatory in her smile, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He'd been cleaning this building for 3 years, and in all that time she'd never once acknowledged his existence. None of them had. He was the ghost who emptied their trash and made their messes disappear. He pushed his cart into the room, the wheels squeaking on the polished hardwood. "Yes, ma'am. Just here to empty the bins and wipe down the table." No, she said, waving a dismissive hand. Her diamond bracelet caught the light, throwing small rainbows across the wall. "We actually wanted to talk to you. We were just having a discussion about the current state of the economy, and we realized something fascinating." She paused, letting the tension build while the men around the table leaned back in their chairs, grinning like jackals. "We realized that we spend all our time listening to experts. Economists with PhDs, analysts with decades of experience, consultants who charge thousands of dollars an hour. But we never hear from, well, regular people. Real Americans, as they say." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He knew where this was going. He'd seen this performance before in different forms. The rich loved to play these games to remind themselves and everyone else of the vast canyon between their world and everyone else's. Richard Hastings chimed in, barely suppressing a smirk. "That's right. I mean, you're out there in the real world, Marcus. You probably have a better sense of what's happening on Main Street than any of us do from up here in our ivory tower." The condescension dripped from every word, thick as honey and twice as cloying. Catherine leaned forward, her elbows on the table, her expression one of exaggerated curiosity. "So here's what we'd like to know, Marcus. If you were in my position, sitting at the head of an $8 billion company, what financial advice would you give? How would you navigate these turbulent economic waters?" The room erupted in barely contained laughter. David Park actually had to wipe tears from his eyes. Jonathan Webb raised his glass in a mock toast. This was entertainment for them, a momentary diversion from their world of mergers and acquisition, a chance to feel even more superior by comparison. Marcus stood there, his hands still gripping the handle of his cleaning cart. Every instinct screamed at him to smile, nod, and give them the show they wanted, to play the humble, simple janitor who knew his place, to say something self-deprecating about how he didn't know anything about high finance and then go back to emptying their wastepaper basket. That was the safe play. That was how you kept your job when you had a daughter with medical bills and a mother in a nursing home you could barely afford. But something in Catherine Whitmore's eyes, some particular glint of cruelty, pushed him past his threshold. He thought about his daughter Emma lying in a hospital bed 3 weeks ago, the pneumonia turning her lips blue while he sat helpless because his insurance wouldn't cover the specialist she needed. He thought about his mother, who'd worked 2 jobs her whole life and now couldn't remember his name most days, warehoused in a facility that smelled of disinfectant and despair. He thought about the executives' trash cans, overflowing with takeout from restaurants where a single meal cost more than his weekly grocery budget. Marcus let go of his cart. The silence that followed was sudden and complete. He walked slowly toward the conference table, and something in his bearing made the laughter die in their throat. He pulled out one of the empty chairs, the leather creaking as he sat down, not at the end of the table like a supplicant, but 3 seats from Catherine Whitmore herself. in the space usually reserved for senior partners. "You want financial advice," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that commanded attention. It wasn't a question. Catherine's smile faltered for just a moment, replaced by something that might have been surprise or might have been irritation. "Yes," she said, recovering quickly. "Please, enlighten us." Marcus looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. Most of them were still smiling, waiting for the punchline, for the moment when the janitor would say something foolish they could laugh about for weeks. But a few of them, perhaps sensing something they didn't quite understand, had begun to look uncertain. "First," Marcus said, "I'd ask myself why this company has lost $42 million in the last 6 months to what the quarterly report called operational inefficiencies." The room went very still. Catherine's face hardened. "Excuse me?" "I empty your trash," Marcus continued, his voice still calm, still even. "I see what you throw away. Last month alone, your marketing department scrapped a campaign they'd spent $7 million developing. $3 million of that went to a consulting firm that delivered a 200-page report no one read. I know because I found it in the recycling, still in its shrink wrap. Your acquisitions team flew first class to Singapore 4 times in 2 months for meetings that could have been done over video conference. That's $400,000 in travel expenses. Your CFO ordered $15,000 worth of office furniture for his vacation home and charged it to the company card, listing it as office infrastructure." Jonathan Webb's face went from red to white. Several of the other executives exchanged glances, the amused superiority draining from their expressions like water from a cracked glass. "That's quite enough," Catherine said, her voice sharp as a whip crack. But Marcus saw something flicker behind her eyes. Not just anger, fear. "You asked for advice," Marcus said, "so here it is. Your company isn't failing because of market conditions or economic turbulence. It's failing because of you." The words hung in the air like smoke. Outside the windows, the city glittered, indifferent to the drama unfolding in this room. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang. Somewhere else, a cleaning cart squeaked down an empty hallway. But in this conference room, time seemed to have stopped entirely, frozen by a truth that was too large and too terrible to ignore. Marcus stood up slowly, pushing his chair back under the table with careful precision. "My financial advice, Miss Whitmore. Stop asking what the market can do for you and start asking what you're doing to the people who make this company run. Because I can tell you right now, from someone who sees everything you think is invisible, this house is built on sand, and the tide is coming in." He walked back to his cleaning cart, gripped the handle, and began to push it toward the door. Not a single person in that room said a word. Not a single person moved. They sat frozen in their expensive chairs, surrounded by their expensive things, and for the first time in their carefully curated lives, they had nothing to say. The janitor had spoken truth to power, and power for once had no answer. The wheels of his cart squeaked as he crossed the threshold. The sound echoed in the silence like a verdict being read. Marcus didn't stop walking until he reached the service elevator at the far end of the hallway. His hands were shaking, though whether from adrenaline or fear or the sudden release of 3 years of pent-up frustration, he couldn't say. He jabbed the button with more force than necessary, watching the numbers above the door crawl upward with agonizing slowness. 39, 40, 41. What had he done? What had he possibly been thinking? You didn't talk to people like Catherine Whitmore that way. You didn't sit at their table uninvited. You didn't tell an $8 billion CEO that she was the problem with her own company. Not if you wanted to keep your job. Not if you had a daughter who needed medication that cost $400 a month. Not if you had a mother whose nursing home sent threatening letters about overdue payments. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. Marcus pushed his cart inside and leaned against the back wall, closing his eyes. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the same constant drone he'd heard in every building he'd worked in for the last 15 years. When he opened his eyes, he caught his reflection in the polished steel doors. 41-year-old man in a navy blue maintenance uniform, his dark hair starting to gray at the temples, his face lined with exhaustion that went deeper than lack of sleep. He looked like what he was, a man who'd been ground down by life until there was nothing left but stubbornness and the will to keep going for the people who depended on him. The elevator descended through the building's core, through floors of sleeping offices and darkened conference rooms. Marcus knew every inch of this place. He knew which executive kept a bottle of vodka in his filing cabinet. He knew which department ordered lunch every day and threw away half of it. He knew who was having an affair with whom, whose marriage was falling apart, who was being blackmailed, who was cooking the books. The janitor saw everything because nobody thought to hide anything from him. He was furniture, he was wallpaper, he was nothing, except tonight, for one brief, reckless moment, he'd been something. He'd been a man with a voice and an opinion and the absolute audacity to share it. And now he was going to pay for it. The elevator opened onto the basement level, the maintenance area where he and the other custodial staff kept their supplies. It was nearly midnight. His shift didn't end for another 2 hours, but he knew with absolute certainty that he'd be getting a call before then, probably from HR, probably to inform him that his services were no longer required. They'd call it downsizing or restructuring or some other corporate euphemism that meant the same thing. You're fired. He parked his cart in its designated space, next to the rows of industrial cleaning supplies in the time clock that had marked the hours of his life for the past 3 years. The basement always smelled like bleach and floor wax, a chemical scent that had long since stopped bothering him. He sat down on an overturned bucket, pulled out his phone and stared at the screen. No messages yet, no calls. Just the background photo of Emma taken last summer at Coney Island, her face smeared with cotton candy, her smile wide enough to break his heart. He should call her. He should warn her that things might get difficult for a while. That they might have to move, might have to find a cheaper apartment, might have to make do with even less than they already had. But he couldn't bear to hear the worry in her voice. Not tonight, not when he just destroyed their fragile stability for the sake of pride. Quite a show. Marcus jerked his head up. Catherine Whitmore stood in the doorway of the maintenance area, still in her steel gray suit, still perfectly composed, but she'd removed her jacket, and her heels clicked against the concrete floor as she walked toward him. There was no entourage, no security, no witnesses, just the CEO and the janitor in the fluorescent-lit bowels of her building. He stood up slowly, his muscles tense. "Ma'am, I apologize if I was out of line. I shouldn't have spoken to you that way." "Sit down, Marcus, it wasn't a request." He sat. Catherine Whitmore pulled up another overturned bucket and sat across from him, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something expensive and subtle that probably had a French name. She studied him with those cold gray eyes, and he realized for the first time that she looked tired, bone tired, the kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix. "How did you know?" she asked finally. "Know what?" "About the Singapore trips. About the furniture, about the marketing campaign." Her voice was flat, controlled, but there was something underneath it, something raw. "How did you know about any of that?" Marcus hesitated. "I told you, I empty the trash. I see the receipts, the memos, the documents people throw away because they think nobody's looking. I see everything, and you remember it all." "I remember what matters." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Do you know how many people I pay to do exactly what you just did? To find inefficiencies, to identify problems, to tell me the truth about what's happening in my own company?" She held up her hand, finger spread. "5 consulting firms, 27 auditors, an entire department of internal oversight. They cost me millions of dollars a year, and not one of them, not a single one, has ever told me what you just told me in 5 minutes." "Maybe they're afraid of you," Marcus said. "Maybe they should be." She leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, her posture so at odds with the corporate queen he'd seen in the conference room that she almost looked like a different person. "You have a daughter, Emma. She's 13. She was hospitalized 3 weeks ago with pneumonia." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. "How do you know that?" "I know everything about my employees, Marcus, even the ones I pretend not to see." She pulled out her phone, tapped the screen a few times, and turned it toward him. It was Emma's hospital bill, the one that had maxed out his credit card and left him eating ramen noodles for 2 weeks straight. "I also know that your mother is in Riverside Care Facility, that you're 3 months behind on payments, and that you've been picking up extra shifts cleaning office buildings on your days off to try to catch up." He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The casual invasion of his privacy. The easy way she rattled off the most painful facts of his life. It was like being flayed alive. "I'm not telling you this to be cruel," Catherine said, her voice softening slightly. "I'm telling you because I need you to understand something. You were right. Everything you said up there, you were absolutely right. My company is hemorrhaging money because I've surrounded myself with people who tell me what I want to hear instead of what I need to know. I've built an empire on sand, just like you said, and I need someone who can see the truth, someone who isn't afraid to tell it to me." Marcus shook his head slowly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to hire you." The words landed like a physical blow. "Hire me? I already work here, not as a janitor." She stood up, pacing now, her energy suddenly electric. "I want you to be my consultant, my advisor, my eyes and ears in this company. You keep doing exactly what you've been doing, seeing what nobody else sees. But instead of throwing it away, you report it to me. Directly to me. Nobody else needs to know. You'll keep your janitor job as cover. But I'll pay you a salary of $200,000 a year, cash, untraceable, enough to take care of your daughter, your mother, and yourself. $200,000. The number was so absurd, so impossibly large that Marcus almost laughed. He made $32,000 a year. 200,000 was a different universe. It was Emma's medication without worry. It was his mother in a facility that treated her like a human being. It was breathing room. It was security. It was everything he'd been desperately scrambling for since his wife died 5 years ago. "Why?" he asked. "Why me?" "Because you're the only person in this building who isn't trying to use me for something. You're the only one who told me the truth, even though it could cost you everything. That kind of honesty is rare, Marcus. It's valuable, and right now it's exactly what I need." He wanted to say yes. Every practical bone in his body screamed at him to say yes. But there was something in her eyes, something calculating and cold, that made him hesitate. This wasn't altruism. This wasn't kindness. This was a business transaction. And Catherine Whitmore didn't make business transactions unless she was certain she'd come out ahead. "What's the catch?" he asked. She smiled, and for the first time, it reached her eyes. "Smart man. The catch is that you'll be answering to me and only me. What you find, what you report, it stays between us. You'll be operating in the shadows, Mark. No recognition, no credit, just the money and the knowledge that you're helping to save this company. And if I say no," the smile faded, "and you go back to emptying trash cans, and I go back to pretending I don't see you, and we both continue our slow march toward disaster, alone." She held out her hand. Not a handshake of equals, but an offer from someone with all the power to someone with none. Marcus looked at that perfectly manicured hand, at the diamond rings that cost more than his car, at the woman who'd just laid bare all his vulnerabilities and weaknesses and offered him an escape. He thought about Emma, about the relief on her face when he told her they could afford the good medicine now. He thought about his mother, about moving her to a place with gardens and real food and nurses who cared. He thought about sleep, real sleep, without the constant gnawing anxiety of unpaid bills. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He lay in his small one-bedroom apartment in Queens, staring at the water-stained ceiling, listening to the neighbor's television through the thin wall. Emma was asleep in the bedroom, her breathing steady and peaceful in a way that made his chest ache. He'd given her the bedroom when they'd moved here 3 years ago after selling the house in New Jersey where she'd grown up. He slept on the pull-out couch, which had a spring that dug into his lower back and sheets that never quite stayed tucked in. $200,000. The number spun through his mind like a slot machine that had finally hit jackpot. It was more money than his father had made in 5 years of breaking his back in construction. More money than his mother had earned in a decade of cleaning houses for wealthy families in Connecticut. It was generational wealth, the kind of money that could change the trajectory of Emma's entire life. But it came with strings. Invisible ones maybe, but strings nonetheless. Catherine Whitmore hadn't become a billionaire by being generous. She wanted something from him. Something more than just reports about wasted office supplies and fraudulent expense accounts. She wanted loyalty. She wanted someone who would be hers, completely and totally answerable only to her. At 5 in the morning, Marcus gave up on sleep. He made coffee in the ancient percolator that had belonged to his parents, the one that sputtered and hissed like it was angry at the world. He sat at the small kitchen table, the one that wobbled unless you put a folded napkin under the left leg, and stared at Catherine Whitmore's business card. Embossed letters on heavy cream stock. Catherine L. Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer, Whitmore Financial Holdings. And below it in smaller print, a phone number he suspected very few people had. Emma shuffled out of the bedroom at 6:30, her hair a tangled mess, wearing the oversized t-shirt she used as pajamas. She was at that awkward age where she wasn't quite a child anymore, but wasn't ready to be a teenager either. She had her mother's eyes, warm and brown and capable of seeing straight through any lie Marcus tried to tell. "You're up early," she said, pouring herself a glass of orange juice. "Couldn't sleep? Just thinking about work." She gave him that look, the one that said she knew he was hiding something but would let it slide for now. "Dad, you know you can talk to me, right? I'm not a little kid anymore, I know, sweetheart. Is it about money? Because I can get a job. Miss Patterson down the hall said she'd pay me to walk her dog." Marcus felt something crack in his chest. She was 13 years old and she was already worrying about money. Already trying to figure out how to lighten his burden. He tried so hard to shield her from the constant financial anxiety that colored every decision he made. But children weren't stupid. They knew when their parent was drowning. "We're gonna be okay," he said, and for the first time in years it didn't feel like a lie. "Actually, I might have some good news soon. There might be an opportunity at work. More money." Her face lit up in a way that made him want to both laugh and cry. "Really? Like a promotion?" "Something like that." She threw her arms around his neck, squeezing tight. "That's amazing, Dad. Maybe we could get a bigger apartment. One where you don't have to sleep on the couch, maybe?" he said, hugging her back, breathing in the smell of her strawberry shampoo. "We'll see." After he dropped Emma at school, Marcus stood on the sidewalk and pulled out his phone. It was 8 in the morning. Catherine had said to call at noon, but he needed to know this was real before he let himself hope, before he let Emma hope. He dialed the number on the card. She answered on the second ring. "I was wondering if you'd call early." Her voice was crisp, professional, utterly unsurprised. "Having second thoughts?" "I want to know what you really want from me," Marcus said. "The real reason, not the story about honesty and fresh perspectives." There was a pause and then a sound that might have been a laugh. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for. All right, the truth. I'm being pushed out, Marcus. My own board is trying to remove me. They think I've lost my edge, that I'm not capable of steering the company through the current economic climate. They're building a case against me piece by piece, and I need someone who can find the dirt before they do. Someone who can dig up the skeletons in their closets before they dig up mine." The honesty was startling and terrifying. "So you want me to spy on your executives? I want you to level the playing field. These men have been playing corporate warfare for decades. They know all the tricks, all the angles, but they don't see you. They never have. That invisibility is the most powerful weapon you could possibly give me. And if I find something that incriminates you," another pause, longer this time, "then I suppose we'll find out whether your loyalty can be bought or if you're the honest man I think you are. Either way, $200,000 should make that decision easier." It was a challenge and a threat wrapped in an expensive package. Marcus looked up at the gray sky, at the buildings stretching toward the clouds, at the city that chewed people up and spit them out without a second thought. He thought about his father, who'd died at 53 from a heart attack brought on by decades of stress and debt. He thought about his mother, who'd worked herself into early dementia trying to keep food on the table. He thought about all the years he'd been invisible, all the times he'd swallowed his pride and his anger and his humanity to keep a roof over his daughter's head. "I'll do it," he said, "but I want the first month's payment up front, before I dig up anything for you. Deal? Come to my office at 8 tonight after hours. Use the service entrance. I'll have everything ready." She hung up without saying goodbye. Marcus stood there holding his phone, feeling like he'd just signed something written in blood. Around him, the city rushed past, people hurrying to jobs that would barely pay their rent, chasing dreams that would never quite materialize. He'd spent 15 years being one of them, and in a single conversation, he'd just stepped into a different world entirely. That evening, Marcus arrived at the Whitmore building at 7:45. The lobby was empty except for a bored security guard who barely glanced at his ID. He took the service elevator to the 47th floor, his heart hammering against his ribs. The executive executive wing was dark, the offices empty, the silence almost oppressive after the constant hum of activity during the day. Catherine's office was at the end of the hall behind double doors of frosted glass. He knocked once and her voice called out for him to enter. If the conference room had been impressive, her office was something else entirely. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, the city lights spreading out like a galaxy. The furniture was minimal but clearly expensive, all clean lines and dark wood. One wall was covered in framed magazine covers, Catherine's face staring out from Forbes, Fortune, Businessweek, always with that same controlled smile that never reached her eyes. She sat behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of mahogany, a laptop open in front of her. She'd changed into a black turtleneck and slacks, her hair down for the first time since he'd met her. It made her look younger, more human, though the steel in her eyes remained. "Close the door," she said. He did. She pulled out a manila envelope from her desk drawer and slid it across the polished surface. $16,666. The first month's payment in cash. Count it if you want. Marcus opened the envelope. The money was there, crisp $100 bills bound in neat stacks. More cash than he'd ever held in his life. He thought about what it could buy. 3 months of his mother's care facility, Emma's medication for a year, a security deposit on a better apartment, a future that wasn't defined by constant scarcity. "I need you to sign something first," Catherine said, pushing a document across the desk. "It's a non-disclosure agreement. Everything you see, everything you hear, everything you report to me stays confidential. If you break it, I'll sue you for every cent you've ever earned and every cent you ever will earn." Marcus read through the document. It was dense with legal language, but the core was clear. He was agreeing to silence, to secrecy, to being Catherine Whitmore's shadow in exchange for money that would change his life. He thought about walking away. He thought about maintaining his integrity, his independence, his soul. Then he thought about Emma's face when she'd hugged him this morning, the hope in her eyes when he'd mentioned more money. He thought about his mother, trapped in a facility where the staff barely remembered her name. He thought about all the years of struggling, of scraping by, of being invisible. Marcus signed the document. Catherine smiled, a real smile this time, sharp and satisfied. "Welcome aboard, Marcus-chun. Now let me tell you exactly what I need you to find." The transformation happened slowly, like ice melting in spring. On the surface, nothing changed. Marcus still arrived at the Whitmore building at 8 every evening, still pushed his cleaning cart through the hallways, still emptied trash cans and wiped down desks. To everyone else, he was the same invisible janitor he'd always been, but underneath, everything was different. He began to see the building not as a place he cleaned, but as a landscape of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Every office was a treasure trove of information. Every carelessly discarded document was potential ammunition. Every whispered conversation in an empty conference room was intelligence to be gathered and reported. Catherine had given him a list of names. 7 executives on the board who she suspected were orchestrating her removal. Richard Hastings, the acquisitions VP who'd laughed the loudest in that conference room. David Park, who ran international operations with an iron fist. Jonathan Webb, the CFO, whose expense reports Marcus had already exposed. 3 others he barely knew by sight, senior partners who operated in the highest circles of corporate power. And at the top of the list, circled in red ink, was a name that surprised him, Gerald Whitmore, Catherine's own uncle, the man who'd helped her father build the company 40 years ago. "He thinks the company should have gone to him when my father died," Catherine had explained, her voice flat and emotionless. "He's never forgiven me for inheriting it. Instead, he's been waiting for me to fail so he can swoop in and take what he believes is rightfully his." Marcus had studied that list in his apartment, memorizing the names and faces, and felt the weight of what he'd agreed to settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. These weren't just executives. They were titans of industry, men with connections that reached into every corner of the financial world, and he was supposed to find their vulnerabilities, their secrets, their sins. The first week was reconnaissance. Marcus paid attention to patterns. Who stayed late? Who came in early? Who met with whom behind closed doors? Richard Hastings, he noticed, spent an unusual amount of time in the office of Linda Chun, the head of legal. They'd leave together sometimes, taking the elevator down to the parking garage when they thought no one was watching. Marcus made a note. David Park received packages, not through normal mail, but hand-delivered by courier after hours. Marcus had been cleaning Park's office when one arrived, watched Park sign for it with a nervous glance toward the door. The package disappeared into his briefcase immediately. Marcus made another note. Jonathan Webb was the easiest. The CFO was arrogant enough to think his trash wasn't worth examining carefully. Marcus found receipts for a condo in Miami, purchased under an LLC that wasn't disclosed in Webb's financial statements to the board. He found emails printed out and crumpled, correspondence with a real estate developer about a project that Whitmore Financial had just coincidentally approved for a massive loan. He found the outline of an empire built on conflicts of interest and creative accounting. Marcus photographed everything with the phone Catherine had given him, a burner with an encrypted connection that couldn't be traced. He uploaded the photos to a secure server she'd set up, and twice a week they met in her office after midnight to review what he'd found. "This is good," Catherine said during their third meeting, scrolling through the images on her laptop. "Webb is dirty as hell. We can use this." "Use it how?" Marcus asked. "To make him understand that his cooperation is preferable to his termination." She looked up at him, her expression calculating. Corporate warfare isn't about destroying your enemies, Mark. It's about collecting enough leverage to make them stop being your enemy. It was a worldview Marcus was beginning to understand, and it disturbed. This wasn't about right and wrong. It wasn't about justice or truth. It was about power and the careful accumulation of weapons that could be deployed when necessary. He was helping to build an arsenal of blackmail, and with each document he photographed, each secret he uncovered, he felt himself slipping further into a world where morality was negotiable and ethics were just another form of currency. The money helped ease his conscience. The first payment had covered 3 months of his mother's care facility and Emma's medical expenses, with enough left over to move to a better apartment. The second payment, which arrived exactly on schedule, went into a savings account, the first one Marcus had been able to open in years. The third payment bought Emma a new laptop for school and paid off the credit card debt that had been strangling him since his wife's death. With each deposit, Marcus felt the chains of poverty loosening, felt the constant anxiety that had defined his adult life beginning to recede. He slept better. He ate better. He could look his daughter in the eye without the crushing shame of barely being able to provide for her. The price was his integrity, and increasingly he found himself thinking that maybe integrity was overrated when compared to security. But there were moments when the weight of what he was doing crushed him, like when he found himself going through Richard Hastings's desk drawers at 2 in the morning, searching for evidence of the affair Catherine suspected, or when he downloaded emails from David Park's computer using a keystroke logger Catherine's IT person had helped him install, or when he stood in Gerald Whitmore's office, photographing financial documents that detailed the old man's failing health and mounting medical bills, information that could be weaponized against him. In those moments, Marcus would think about his father, who'd never compromised his principles, even when it cost him opportunities, who'd turned down unreasonable payments from contractors who wanted to cut corners, who'd died poor but honest. Marcus wondered what his father would think of him now, creeping through offices like a thief in the night, collecting other people's secrets for money. It was during his 4th week that Marcus discovered something he wasn't supposed to find. He was cleaning David Park's office, going through the routine of emptying the trash and dusting the shelves, when he noticed that one of the books in Park's expensive collection was slightly out of alignment. It was an old habit from his days of poverty, noticing when things weren't quite right. When something was hidden, he pulled the book out. Behind it was a flash drive taped to the back of the shelf. Marcus glanced toward the door, listened for footsteps, then pulled the drive free and pocketed it. Back in the basement, he plugged it into the secure phone Catherine had given him. What he found made his blood run cold. The flash drive contained emails between David Park and someone named Vincent Caruso, who Marcus recognized as the CEO of Meridian Capital, one of Whitmore Financial's biggest competitors. The emails detailed a plan to short sell Whitmore stock, to spread rumors about the company's instability, to orchestrate a crisis that would tank the share price and allow Meridian to acquire Whitmore at a fraction of its value. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Gerald Whitmore was copying on every email. Catherine's uncle was actively conspiring to destroy his own family's company, to engineer his niece's downfall so completely that she'd have no choice but to sell. The betrayal was breathtaking in its scope and cruelty. Marcus sat in the dim light of the basement staring at the screen and realized he was holding something that could destroy lives. Gerald Whitmore would be ruined, probably prosecuted for corporate espionage and securities fraud. David Park would go to prison. The entire board would be implicated. Whitmore Financial itself might not survive the scandal. He should have uploaded the files immediately. That was his job. That was what Catherine was paying him $200,000 a year to do. But something made him hesitate. Once he handed this over, there would be no going back. The war that had been cold would turn hot, and the casualties would be counted in billions of dollars and destroyed reputations. Marcus thought about Gerald Whitmore, who he'd seen exactly once, a frail old man in his 80s being helped into a car by his nurse. He thought about the man's medical bills, the evidence of cancer treatments and experimental therapies that weren't covered by insurance. Gerald Whitmore was dying, and his last act on earth was going to be trying to take back the company he believed should have been his. There was tragedy in that. Ugly, human tragedy. And Marcus was about to be the instrument of the old man's final humiliation. He stared at the phone for a long time, his thumb hovering over the upload button. $200,000 a year, Emma's future, his mother's care, a life without the constant terror of poverty. All of it depended on him doing his job, on him being the weapon Catherine had hired him to be. Marcus uploaded the files. The message came back within 5 minutes. Catherine's response was a single word: perfect. He sat alone in the basement, surrounded by cleaning supplies and the smell of disinfectant. Felt something inside him break. He'd crossed a line tonight, moved from corporate spy to active participant in someone's destruction. He tried to tell himself it was justified that Gerald Whitmore had made his choices and deserved whatever consequences came his way. He tried to convince himself that this was just business, that this was how the world worked at the highest levels. But he couldn't shake the image of that old man dying and desperate, making one last play for the legacy he'd been denied. Couldn't shake the knowledge that he, Marcus Chun, the invisible janitor, the honest man who'd spoken truth to power, had just become exactly the kind of person he'd always despised. His phone buzzed. Another message from Catherine. Meet me tomorrow night. We need to discuss next steps. Marcus put the phone in his pocket and went back to work. There were still offices to clean, trash to empty, floors to mop. The routine was comforting in its mindlessness. For a few hours, he could just be a janitor again, just push his cart and wipe down surfaces and exist in the simple, uncomplicated space between dirty and clean. But when his shift ended at 4 in the morning and he walked out into the pre-dawn darkness, Marcus knew that the simple life was gone forever. He'd made his choice, taken the money, agreed to play the game, and now he would have to live with the consequences, whatever they turned out to be. Above him, the Whitmore building stretched into the sky, its windows dark except for one, the 47th floor, Catherine's office. She was up there right now, he knew, planning her next move, deciding how to use the weapon he'd just handed her. And somewhere in the building, Gerald Whitmore's office sat empty, the old man sleeping peacefully at home, unaware that his fate had just been sealed by a janitor with a phone and a conscience he could no longer afford. The board meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon. Marcus knew because he'd seen the calendar invitation when he was cleaning Catherine's office, had watched her stare at it with an expression that was equal parts anticipation and something darker, something that looked almost like hunger. The meeting agenda was innocuous: quarterly review, strategic planning, routine business. But Marcus knew better. This was where Catherine would deploy the nuclear option he'd provided. The days leading up to the meeting were strange. The building hummed with a tension that even the oblivious executives seemed to feel. Conversations stopped when people walked by. Doors were closed that were usually open. The casual arrogance that had defined the place was replaced by something warier, more careful. Word had leaked that something big was coming, though no one knew exactly what. Marcus went about his work with mechanical precision, but he couldn't focus. His hands cleaned surfaces, his mind barely registered. He emptied trash cans without seeing their contents. He was haunted by what he'd done, by the chain of events he'd set in motion. At night, he dreamed of Gerald Whitmore's face, though he'd only seen the man once. In the dreams, the old man looked at him with eyes that held knowledge and accusation, that saw Marcus for exactly what he was. Emma noticed. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked over breakfast on Thursday morning. "You seem different lately." "Different how?" "I don't know. Distracted. And you're always checking your phone. Is everything all right at work?" He forced a smile. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Better than fine, actually. I told you about the opportunity, remember? Things are looking up." She studied him with those too perceptive eyes. "You don't look like things are looking up. You look worried. Just work stuff. Adult things. Nothing for you to worry about." But he was worried. Terribly, deeply worried. Not about the money or the job or even about getting caught. He was worried about who he was becoming, about the man he saw in the mirror each morning. His father's son had been honest, principled, unwilling to compromise his integrity even when it cost him. This new Marcus, the one who spied and gathered dirt and enabled corporate warfare, was a stranger wearing his face. On Thursday night, Catherine called him to her office at 11. She was dressed in full armor again, a sharp black suit that looked like it cost more than Marcus's car. Her hair pulled back in that severe style that made her look both elegant and intimidating. The desk in front of her was covered in documents, printed emails, financial statements, the evidence Marcus had gathered over the past month, laid out like weapons before a battle. "Sit," she said without looking up. Marcus sat. "Tomorrow is going to be interesting," Catherine continued, still reviewing the documents. "I'm going to present this evidence to the board. All of it. David Park's conspiracy with Meridian Capital, Jonathan Webb's undisclosed properties and conflicts of interest, Richard Hastings's affair with the head of legal which violates our ethics policy, and Gerald." She finally looked up, her gray eyes hard as steel. "My dear Uncle Gerald, who's been selling out his own family's company piece by piece? What will happen to them?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "Park will be fired and probably prosecuted. The emails are evidence of securities fraud, corporate espionage, conspiracy to manipulate stock prices. He'll be lucky if he only gets 10 years. Webb will resign before I can fire him, but I'll make sure every financial institution in the country knows he's radioactive. Hastings will be forced out with a severance package designed to buy his silence. And Gerald ... single quotes." She paused, a slight smile touching her lips. "Gerald will retire for health reasons. I'm not completely heartless, Marcus. He's dying. I won't add prison time to his final months, but he will step down from the board, sell his shares back to the company at a discount, and disappear quietly. And you'll be safe," Marcus said. "Your position's secure. More than secure. I'll be untouchable. The board members who aren't implicated will be so terrified of being next that they'll fall in line immediately. I'll have complete control of this company for the first time since my father died." She leaned back in her chair, satisfaction radiating from her. "You did good work, Marcus. Better than I expected." He should have felt proud. He should have felt accomplished. Instead, he felt hollow, as if something essential had been scooped out of his chest and replaced with ash. "I want to show you something," Catherine said, standing up. She walked to the window looking out over the city lights. "Come here." Marcus joined her at the window. From this height, Manhattan looked like a circuit board, glowing lines of light connecting nodes of power and commerce. It was beautiful in an abstract way, divorced from the messy reality of the people living and working and struggling in those buildings. "My father used to bring me up here when I was a little girl," Catherine said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. He'd point to different buildings and tell me who owned them, what deals had been made, what empires had risen and fallen. He taught me that business was war by other means, that sentiment and ethics were luxuries we couldn't afford if we wanted to survive. She turned to look at Marcus. He was right, you know. The world doesn't reward goodness. It rewards strength. Is that what you think you're showing tomorrow? Strength? Yes. No hesitation, no doubt. I'm showing everyone that crossing me has consequences, that loyalty is rewarded and betrayal is punished. That's how you lead, Marcus. Not with inspirational speeches or team-building exercises, but with fear and respect in equal measure. Marcus thought about his father again, about the construction sites where he'd worked, about the way men had respected him not because they feared him, but because he treated them fairly, paid them what he'd promised, never asked them to compromise their safety or their principles. His father had led with integrity and men had followed him willingly, but his father had also died broke, worn down by a system that valued profit over. What am I? Marcus asked. In your world, what am I to you? Catherine looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time seeing him as something other than a useful tool. You're the most valuable asset I have. You're my eyes and ears, my early warning system. You're proof that loyalty can be bought if the price is right. She reached out and touched his arm, a gesture that was probably meant to be reassuring but felt clinical, calculated. You're also my friend, Marcus. I know that sounds strange given the circumstances, but it's true. You're one of the few people who isn't afraid to tell me the truth. The truth, Marcus repeated. You want to know the truth? The truth is that I feel like I sold my soul. I look at my daughter and I wonder what she'd think if she knew what I was doing. I look at myself in the mirror and I don't recognize the person staring back. That's called growth, Catherine said. You're becoming who you need to be to survive in this world. The janitor who spoke up in that conference room, that was brave but stupid. Bravery doesn't pay your daughter's medical bills. It doesn't move your mother to a better care facility. You made a choice to prioritize your family over abstract principles, and there's no shame in that, isn't there? She turned back to the window. Do you want to quit? Because you can. I'll honor our agreement through the end of the year, give you severance, and we'll part ways. You can go back to being invisible, back to struggling, back to that apartment in Queens with the water-stained ceiling. You can tell yourself you maintained your integrity. Will that make you feel better when Emma needs medication you can't afford? It was a cruel question because it was also a fair one. Marcus had spent years prioritizing pride over pragmatism, and where had it gotten him? His wife had died in a hospital that was more concerned about insurance coverage than saving lives. His mother had declined into dementia in a facility that treated its residents like inventory. His daughter had learned to stop asking for things because she knew they couldn't afford them, all because Marcus had clung to abstract notions of right and wrong while the world rewarded people who were willing to be flexible with their morals. No, he said finally. I don't want to quit. Good. Catherine smiled, the warmth in it actually reaching her eyes this time. Because tomorrow, after the board meeting, your salary doubles. $400,000 a year. Consider it a performance bonus. $400,000. The number was absurd. Obscene, life-changing. It was Emma's college education fully funded. It was his mother in the best facility in the state. It was security for the rest of his life. It was also the price of his complicity, the number that would bind him to Catherine Whitmore and her corporate warfare permanently. Why? Marcus asked. Why so much? Because what's coming next is going to be harder. Once I've cleaned house on the board, I'm going to need you to go deeper. There are competitors I need to understand, politicians I need leverage on, regulators who need to be persuaded that Whitmore Financial is operating above board. You're going to be my intelligence network, Mark. And I pay well for loyalty. There it was. The next level of compromise, the next step into the darkness. It would never be enough for Catherine. There would always be another target, another secret to uncover, another line to cross. And with each step, Marcus would sink deeper into a world where morality was negotiable and ethics were just another commodity to be traded. He should have said no, should have drawn a line, set a boundary, reclaimed some portion of his integrity. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was, "When do we start?" Catherine's smile widened. That's what I like to hear. We start after tomorrow. First, let's win this war. Then we can plan the next campaign. She walked back to her desk and pulled out a bottle of scotch from a drawer, the expensive kind that probably cost $1,000. She poured 2 glasses and handed one to Marcus. To victory, she said, raising her glass. Marcus clinked his glass against hers, the crystal ringing like a bell. To victory, he echoed, though the word tasted like ashes in his mouth. He drank the scotch. It burned going down, smooth and peaty and perfect. It was the best alcohol he'd ever tasted, and he hated that he loved it. Hated that some part of him was already adapting to this life, already finding pleasure in the trappings of wealth and power. He was becoming the kind of man he'd once despised, and the worst part was how easy it was, how natural it felt to rationalize, to justify, to accept that this was just how the world worked. When he left Catherine's office that night, the sunrise was just beginning to paint the eastern sky pink and gold. Marcus stood outside the building, breathing in the cool morning air, watching the city wake up. Somewhere out there, people were heading to honest jobs, living honest lives, struggling but maintaining their integrity. And here he was, a spy in a janitor's uniform, preparing to watch powerful men be destroyed by the information he'd gathered. He thought about his father one last time, about what the old man would say if he could see him now. Then Marcus pushed the thought away, buried it deep where it couldn't hurt him. His father's way had led to an early grave and a pauper's funeral. Marcus's way, this new compromised way, would lead to security and comfort and all the things his father had never been able to provide. He told himself it was worth it. He told himself he was doing the right thing, or at least the necessary thing. He told himself a lot of things as he walked to the subway station. And if none of them were quite true, well, that was just another compromise he'd learned to make. Friday arrived with the weight of inevitability. Marcus went through his morning routine in a daze, making Emma breakfast, dropping her at school, avoiding her questions about why he seemed so distracted. The board meeting was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. Marcus wouldn't be there, of course. Janitors didn't attend board meeting, but he would be in the building, would feel the shockwave when Catherine detonated the bomb he'd helped her build. He arrived for his evening shift at 8, 4 hours after the meeting had ended. The building felt different. The air was charged with electricity, with fear, with the aftermath of violence. Marcus pushed his cart through the lobby, nodding at the security guard whose face was tight with barely suppressed gossip. Something had happened. Something big. The executive floor was chaos barely contained. Office doors stood open, lights blazing in rooms that should have been dark. Marcus could hear raised voices, phones ringing unanswered, the sound of someone crying behind a closed door. He moved slowly through the hallway, his cart squeaking, his eyes taking in everything. David Park's office was empty, not just empty of people, but empty of everything. His desk had been cleared, his personal effects removed, even the expensive art on his walls taken down. It looked like a crime scene after the body had been removed, sterile and haunting. A cardboard box sat by the door, sealed with security tape, ready to be shipped to wherever Park would land after the dust settled, if he avoided prison. Richard Hastings' office was occupied. Marcus could see him through the glass, sitting at his desk with his head in his hand. A woman Marcus didn't recognize stood over him, her posture aggressive, her voice too low to hear, but her anger unmistakable. His wife, Marcus guessed. The affair had been exposed, and now Hastings was paying the price not just professionally but personally. Jonathan Webb's office was dark, but someone had spray painted the word thief across his door in angry red letters. Building security hadn't cleaned it off yet, leaving it as a warning or perhaps as a monument to what happened to people who stole from Catherine Whitmore. Marcus continued his rounds, his stomach churning. He'd known this was coming. He'd prepared for it, rationalized it, accepted it as necessary. But seeing the actual human cost of what he'd done was different. These were real people with real lives, and he'd destroyed them. That they'd been corrupt, that they'd betrayed Catherine first, didn't make it easier to bear. He was cleaning a conference room when he heard footsteps behind him. Gerald Whitmore stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on a cane. He looked even frailer than Marcus remembered, his suit hanging loose on a frame that had once been powerful but was now withered by age and illness. His eyes, though, were sharp and clear and filled with something Marcus couldn't quite identify. Not anger, something sadder than anger. "You're the janitor," Gerald said, his voice thin but steady. "The one who spoke up at the meeting, the one who told Catherine she was the problem." Marcus straightened up, his heart hammering. "Yes, sir. And then she hired you. Not as a janitor, I'm guessing, but it's something else. Something secret." It wasn't a question. Gerald walked slowly into the room, lowering himself into a chair with the careful movements of someone whose body had betrayed him. "She showed me the emails today, the ones proving I'd been conspiring with Meridian Capital. Very thorough documentation, very damning. Someone did excellent work gathering that intelligence." Marcus said nothing. His mouth was dry, his palms sweating. "I don't blame you," Gerald continued, and the kindness in his voice was worse than any accusation could have been. "Catherine is very good at finding people's pressure points, at figuring out what they need and offering it to them. I imagine she pays you well. Certainly better than a janitor's salary." "Why'd you do it?" Marcus asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. "Why try to destroy your own family's company?" Gerald was quiet for a long moment. "Because it should have been mine. My brother and I built Whitmore Financial together, started with nothing and turned it into an empire. But when he died, he left everything to Catherine. Not because she'd earned it, not because she'd proven herself, but because she was his daughter and I was just his brother. Do you know what it's like to pour your life into something and then watch someone else take credit for it?" Marcus thought about his father working himself to death for contractors who got rich off his labor. "Yes," he said quietly, "I think I do." "Then you understand. I'm not saying what I did was right. I'm just saying I understand why I did it." Gerald pulled himself to his feet with visible effort. "The cancer's in my bones now. Pancreas, liver, lungs. I have maybe 6 months, maybe less. I wanted to win before I died. Wanted to prove that I mattered, that I wasn't just a footnote in someone else's story." He walked toward the door, then paused. "Catherine won. She always does. But the victory cost her more than she realizes. She's made enemies today, powerful ones. And she's made you into something you probably never wanted to be. I hope the money's worth it, son. I really do." He left, his cane tapping against the floor, the sound fading as he disappeared down the hallway. Marcus stood alone in the conference room, feeling as if he'd been punched in the chest. Gerald Whitmore had just granted him absolution, had understood and forgiven him, and somehow that made everything worse. Marcus finished his shift in a mechanical haze. He cleaned offices he didn't see, emptied trash cans he barely noticed, moved through the building like a ghost. At midnight, his phone buzzed, Catherine summoning him to her office. She was celebrating when he arrived. A bottle of champagne sat on her desk, half empty, and her face was flushed with victory. "Marcus," she said, her voice bright with triumph. "We did it. We actually did it." "What happened?" he asked, though he'd already pieced most of it together. "Everything went perfectly. I presented the evidence, and the board had no choice but to act immediately. Park was terminated and escorted from the building by security. He's being investigated by the SEC as we speak. Webb resigned before I could fire him, which was smart of him. Hastings will be gone by Monday. And Gerald ... says more quotes. She paused, taking a sip of champagne. Gerald agreed to step down and sell his shares back to the company. He didn't even fight, just signed the papers and left. He's dying, Marcus said. I know, that's why I didn't push for prosecution. Like I said, I'm not completely heartless. She poured a glass of champagne and held it out to him. Drink with me. This is our victory as much as mine. Marcus took the glass but didn't drink. I saw him tonight. Gerald came to find me. Catherine's expression sharpened. What did he say? He said, you made enemies today. Powerful one. Let them come. The champagne had made her reckless, or perhaps it was the victory. I've beaten them once, I'll beat them again. With you helping me, I'm untouchable. I'm just a janitor with a camera phone. You're so much more than that, and you know it. You're my secret weapon, Marcus. You see everything that everyone else misses. You're invisible in the best possible way. She walked around the desk, standing close to him. $400,000 a year, remember? That starts today. I'm having the contract amended on Monday. The number should have excited him, should have filled him with relief and gratitude. Instead, it felt like a chain being locked around his neck, binding him permanently to this world of corporate warfare and moral compromise. What if I don't want to do this anymore? He asked. Catherine's smile faded. Then you give back everything I've paid you and go back to being a janitor who can barely afford his daughter's medical. Is that what you want? No. Then stop questioning what we're doing and accept that this is your life now. You made a choice, Marcus. You can't unmake it. She was right. That was the terrible truth of it. He'd taken the first payment, signed a non-disclosure agreement, gathered the intelligence that destroyed 3 careers and broke an old man's heart. There was no going back to innocence. No way to reclaim the person he'd been before Catherine Whitmore had offered him money and purpose and a seat at a table where he'd never belonged. I need some air, Marcus said, putting the champagne glass down untouched. Don't take too long. We have work to do. There are other board members who need to understand the new order of things. I want profiles on each of them by the end of next. Marcus nodded and left the office. He rode the elevator down to the lobby, walked out into the cool night air, and kept walking. He walked for blocks, then miles, moving through the sleeping city without destination or purpose. He walked past restaurants where he couldn't afford to eat, past luxury apartments where he couldn't afford to live, past lives he would never have no matter how much Catherine paid him. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, he found himself at Riverside Care Facility, standing outside the locked doors. Through the windows, he could see the night nurse at her station, reading a magazine. His mother was in there somewhere, sleeping in a room he could now afford to keep her in. Emma was safe in their apartment, her medication cabinet stocked, her future secured. He'd done what he needed to do. He'd protected his family. He'd made the pragmatic choice. So why did he feel like he'd lost everything that mattered? Marcus pulled out his phone and looked at the balance in his bank account. The number was higher than it had ever been. Higher than he'd dreamed possible 6 months ago. It was security and stability and all the things he'd fought for his entire adult life. It was also the price he'd accepted for his soul. He thought about Gerald Whitmore, dying slowly and losing his last battle. He thought about David Park, facing prison for crimes Marcus had exposed. He thought about Richard Hastings, whose marriage was collapsing because of infidelity Marcus had documented. And he thought about himself, standing outside in the pre-dawn darkness, rich and miserable and bound to a woman who saw him as nothing more than a useful tool. The first light of morning was breaking over the city skyline when Marcus finally turned back toward home. He had a daughter to wake up, breakfast to make, a life to maintain, and on Monday he would go back to the Whitmore building, push his cart through the hallways, and continue gathering secrets for Kath, because he'd made his choice and there was no unmaking it. There was only living with it, one compromised day at a time, until he could no longer remember the man he used to be. 3 months passed. Winter settled over Manhattan with the kind of cold that penetrated straight to the bone, that made the streets treacherous with ice and the mornings unbearably dark. Marcus moved through his double life with increasing efficiency. The moral discomfort he'd felt at the beginning dulled by repetition and rationalization. He was good at his job, both his jobs. He kept the building clean and Catherine informed, and if the line between the two had blurred beyond recognition, well, that was just another thing he'd learned to accept. The money kept coming. $400,000 a year translated to $33,000 a month, more than Marcus had made in an entire year as just a janitor. He'd moved Emma and himself to a 2-bedroom apartment in a better neighborhood, one where the heat worked and the walls didn't have water stains and the neighbors didn't fight at 3 in the morning. Emma had new clothes, new books, a laptop that didn't freeze every 5 minutes. She'd joined the debate team at school, something she'd always wanted to do, but they'd never been able to afford with all the after-school fees. His mother was now in a facility that looked more like a hotel than a warehouse for dying people. She had her own room with a view of a garden, nurses who called her by name, activities and programs designed to slow the progression of her dementia. On good days, she recognized Marcus when he visited. On bad days, she thought he was his father come back from the dead. But even on the bad days, she seemed happy, which was more than she'd been in years. Marcus should have been happy too. By every objective measure, his life had improved dramatically. He was financially secure for the first time since his wife died. His family was taken care of. He no longer lay awake at night calculating which bills he could let slide another month. But happiness remained elusive, dancing just just out of reach like a mirage in the desert. The problem was Emma. She was 13 now, old enough to notice things, smart enough to ask questions. She'd noticed the new apartment, the new clothes, the suddenly relaxed way Marcus talked about money, and she'd started asking where it all came from. "You said you got a promotion at work," she said one Saturday morning over pancakes. "But you're still a janitor, right?" "I mean, that's what you do. It's a supervisory position," Marcus said, the lie coming as easily now. "I manage other janitors, make sure the work gets done properly. It pays better." "That's great, Dad." But her eyes held doubt. "It's just, you seem different. More stressed, actually. I thought more money was supposed to make things easier." "Adult problems, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about." She didn't look convinced, but she let it drop. Marcus hated lying to her. Hated the way deception had become his default setting, the way truth felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. But what was the alternative? Tell her that her father was a corporate spy, that he made his living digging up dirt on people and weaponizing their secrets, that every good thing in their lives was built on a foundation of betrayal and moral compromise? At work, Catherine's demands had intensified. She'd consolidated power after the board purge, but paranoia had replaced confidence. She saw threats everywhere, enemies in every shadow. She wanted profiles on everyone, her remaining board members, her senior executives, her largest shareholders, even her personal assistant. Marcus spent his nights not just cleaning but installing monitoring software, copying files, photographing documents. He'd become less of a janitor and more of a one-man intelligence agency. The targets weren't always corrupt. That was what bothered Marcus most. Some of the people he investigated were clean, honest professionals doing their jobs well. But Catherine wanted leverage on everyone. Insurance policies against future betrayal. So Marcus dug into their lives anyway, finding the small secrets everyone had. The executive who was quietly gay and hadn't told his conservative family. The board member whose son had a drug problem. The shareholder who'd had a nervous breakdown 5 years ago. None of it was illegal, but all of it could be embarrassing if exposed. All of it could be used as pressure if Catherine decided she needed it. Marcus compiled the reports and filed them away, building an arsenal of human weakness that Catherine hoarded like a dragon hoarding gold. Sometimes he wondered what would happen if someone ever found these files. If the world discovered that Catherine Whitmore had detailed blackmail material on dozens of people, but the files were encrypted, stored on servers that only Catherine could access. They were safe. Everyone was safe as long as they remained loyal. It was on a Tuesday in late February that everything changed. Marcus was in the basement, organizing cleaning supplies, when he heard footsteps on the stairs. He looked up to see a man he didn't recognize, young and sharp-featured in an expensive suit, carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly rent used to be. "Marcus Chun?" the man asked. "Who's asking?" "My name is James Bolt. I'm an attorney with the Securities and Exchange." He pulled out a badge, official and intimidating. "I need to talk to you about Catherine Whitmore and your employment at Whitmore Finance." Marcus's blood turned to ice. This was the nightmare scenario. The one he'd tried not to think about. He'd been so careful, had covered his tracks so thoroughly. How had they found him? "I'm just a janitor," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady. "I clean offices. I don't know anything about Miss Whitmore's business." Bolton smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We both know that's not true. We've been investigating Whitmore Financial for 6 months, Mr. Chun. We know about the board purge, about the evidence that suddenly appeared against David Park and the others. We know that evidence was gathered illegally. And we know you're the one who gathered it. I don't know what you're talking about. You installed keystroke logging software on company computers without authorization. You accessed confidential files without permission. You photographed private documents and transmitted them to Catherine Whitmore. That's computer fraud, conspiracy, possibly espionage depending on what was in those files." Bolton opened his briefcase and pulled out a document. "This is a subpoena. You're required to testify before a grand jury about your activities at Whitmore Financial. If you refuse, you'll be held in contempt. If you lie, you'll be charged with perjury." Marcus took the document with shaking hands. The legal language blurred before his eyes, but the core message was clear. They knew everything. And now they wanted him to testify against Catherine. "I need to talk to a lawyer," Marcus managed to say. "That's smart. You're gonna need one." Bolton pulled out a business card and handed it to Marcus. "Here's my number. When you're ready to talk, call me. And Mr. Chun, you should know that David Park is cooperating with our investigation. He's told us everything about the conspiracy, including Catherine's knowledge of it. If you help us, we can offer immunity. If you don't, you're going to prison along with her." Bolton left, his footsteps echoing up the stairs. Marcus stood alone in the basement, the subpoena in one hand and the business card in the other, feeling as if the floor had just dropped out from beneath him. This was it. The reckoning he'd known was coming, but had convinced himself he could avoid. He pulled out his phone with trembling fingers and called the only number that mattered now. Catherine answered immediately. "We have a problem," Marcus said. 20 minutes later, he was in her office. Catherine had called her lawyer, a woman named Patricia Vance, who had the kind of reputation that made prosecutors nervous. Vance was in her 50s, steel-haired and granite-faced, with eyes that missed nothing. She listened to Marcus's story without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad. "How much do they have?" Catherine asked when Marcus finished. "Everything, apparently," Marcus said. "They know about the monitoring software, the photographed documents, All of it. Single quotes. Vance tapped her pen against her notepad. David Park must have given them more than just his own crimes. He probably laid out the whole operation, your role included, in exchange for a lighter sentence. The question is whether they can prove Catherine knew the information was gathered illegally. I have the non-disclosure agreement, Marcus said. The one I signed. It doesn't explicitly say to break the law, but it's clear I was doing more than just cleaning. That's not enough to convict Catherine, Vance said. Plausible deniability. She can claim she thought you were just being observant, noticing things in the normal course of your work. The burden of proof is on the prosecution to show she specifically directed you to commit crimes. But they'll prosecute me, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. Almost certainly. Unless you cooperate against Catherine, in which case they'll offer immunity. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Marcus looked at Catherine, at the woman who'd given him everything he had, who'd pulled him out of poverty and desperation and offered him a life worth living, and he saw in her eyes the calculation happening, the assessment of whether he would betray her to save himself. I won't testify against you, Marcus heard himself say. I'll take the Fifth Amendment, refused to answer. They can't make me incriminate myself. They can grant you immunity and compel your testimony, Vance said. If they do that and you still refuse, you go to jail for contempt indefinitely. How long is indefinitely? Until you agree to testify or until the grand jury disbands. Could be months, could be years. Marcus thought about Emma. Who would take care of her if he was in jail? His mother was in no condition to care for a teenager. There were no other family members, no safety net. Emma would end up in foster care, bounce between homes, her life destroyed because her father had made terrible choices. There's another option, Catherine said quietly. You could leave tonight. I have resources. Connections. I can get you and Emma out of the country somewhere without an extradition treaty. New identities, enough money to start over. You'd be safe. That's a terrible idea, Vance interjected. Fleeing makes you look guilty and gives the prosecution everything they need to paint you as a criminal. Stay and fight. Let me negotiate with the SEC. Maybe we can work out a deal where Marcus pleads to lesser charges, does minimal time. How minimal? Marcus asked. 6 months. Maybe a year. With good behavior, you'd be out in less. A year. 12 months in prison while Emma grew up without him, while his mother declined in her facility. 12 months of being labeled a criminal, of losing everything he'd worked for. Or he could run, take Catherine's money and her false identities, and spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, always waiting for the knock on the door. I need time to think, Marcus said. You don't have time, Vance countered. The grand jury convenes in 2 weeks. You need to make a decision now. Marcus looked at Catherine. Really looked at her. She met his gaze without flinching, but he saw fear there. Not for herself, but fear that he would break, that he would trade her freedom for his own. And in that moment, Marcus realized something profound and terrible. She'd never seen him as a friend or even as a person. He'd been a tool, a useful instrument that she'd maintained with money and false kindness. And now that the tool was broken, she was calculating how to dispose of it without getting caught. I need to talk to Emma, Marcus said. Before I decide anything, I need to talk to my daughter. Catherine nodded slowly. Do what you need to do. But Marcus, remember what I gave you. Remember who saved you when you were drowning. Loyalty should mean something. He left the office without responding. Loyalty. The word tasted like poison now. He'd been loyal to Catherine, had compromised every principle he held dear in service to her wars, and where it had gotten him, facing prison time while she hid behind lawyers and plausible deniability. Marcus rode the subway home in a daze, barely seeing the other passengers, barely hearing the screech of metal on metal as the train rounded curves. He thought he was making smart choices, pragmatic decisions that would secure his family's future, but he'd just been trading one form of desperation for another, and now the bill had come due. Emma was doing homework at the kitchen table when Marcus walked in. She looked up, smiled, and then her expression changed as she saw his face. The smile died, replaced by concern that was too mature for a 13-year-old to have to carry. Dad, what's wrong? Marcus sat down across from her, his hands shaking. He looked at his daughter, at the bright, intelligent eyes and the face that reminded him so much of her mother, and he realized he couldn't lie anymore. The lies had gotten him into this mess. Maybe the truth could get him out. I need to tell you something, he said. Something I should have told you months ago. Emma closed her textbook, giving him her full attention. You're scaring me. I'm scared too, sweetheart. Marcus took a deep breath. You asked me how we suddenly had money? How we could afford this apartment and your mom's new facility and everything else. I told you I got a promotion, that I was supervising other janitors. That was a lie. He watched her face carefully, saw confusion and then hurt flash across her features. What do you mean? I'm still a janitor. That part is true, but I also do something else for the CEO for Ems, Whitmore. She pays me to watch people, to gather information about what they're doing, to find their secrets. The words came out in a rush, ugly and unadorned. I install programs on their computers that record everything they type. I photograph private documents. I report everything back to her. She uses it against people who threaten her position. Emma stared at him, her expression unreadable. You're a spy. Yes. Is that illegal? Marcus wanted to lie again, to soften the truth, to protect her from the full weight of what he'd done. But he'd promised himself no more lies. Yes, it's illegal, and I've been caught. The government knows what I did, and they want me to testify against Ms. Whitmore. If I do, they'll give me immunity. If I don't, I'll probably go to prison. The words hung in the air between them. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She was her father's daughter. Tough, even when breaking inside. For how long? She whispered. Maybe a year, maybe more. I don't know yet. And if you testify against her, then I go free. But I betray someone who helped us, who gave us all this. He gestured at the apartment, at the comfortable life they'd built on a foundation of sand. Emma was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and sad and devastating. Did you do it for me? Is this my fault? No. Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. No, baby, this is not your fault. This is entirely on me. I made these choices. I told myself I was doing it for you, for us, but that was just an excuse. I did it because I was tired of being poor. I did it because someone offered me a way out and I took it without thinking about the cost. Mom wouldn't have done, Emma said, and the words cut deeper than any prosecution ever could. No, she wouldn't have. Your mom always did the right thing, even when it was hard, even when it cost her. Marcus felt tears burning his eyes. I wish I was more like her. I wish I'd been strong enough to say no. Emma pulled her hands away, wrapping her arms around herself. What happens to me if you go to prison? It was the question Marcus had been dreading. Miss Whitmore offered us another option. We could leave the country tonight. New identities, new life. We'd be safe, but we'd also be running forever. From the government? Yes, so we'd be criminals. Actually, criminals, not just people who did criminal things, but people who ran away from justice. She said it with the black and white morality of youth, the certainty that right and wrong were always clearly delineated. Yes. Emma stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. Marcus watched her, this young person who'd somehow become wise beyond her years through hardship and loss. When she turned back to him, her face was set with determination. Mom used to tell me a story, Emma said, about when she was young and she stole a candy bar from a store. She said she felt so guilty that she couldn't enjoy it, couldn't even eat it. The next day she went back, returned the candy bar, and apologized to the owner. She said the worst part wasn't getting caught. It was knowing she'd done something wrong and trying to live with it. Marcus nodded. He remembered Sarah telling him that story too. Remembered how she'd used it to illustrate her belief that integrity was more important than comfort, that who you were mattered more than what you had. You can't run, Dad, Emma continued. If we run, we become different people, worse people, and we'd spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, always scared. That's not a life. That's just a different kind of prison. But if I go to jail, you'll be alone. Foster care, bouncing between homes. I can't do that. I'm not alone. Emma came back to the table, sat down, took her father's hands this time. I have Grandma. Even if she doesn't always remember me, she's still family. And I have friends, teachers, people who care about me. I'll be okay, Dad. I'm stronger than you think. Marcus looked at his daughter, at this incredible human being he'd somehow helped create. He felt a profound mixture of pride and shame. She was stronger than him. She had more integrity at 13 than he'd shown in 41 years. And she was telling him to do the right thing, even though it would hurt both of them. If I cooperate with the investigation, Marcus said slowly, if I testify against Miss Whitmore, she'll destroy. She has lawyers, resources, ways of making my life hell. And she won't just come after me. She'll come after you too. Let her try. There was steel in Emma's voice now, a fierceness that reminded Marcus of Sarah at her most determined. We stopped letting people scare us the day we left Jersey. We've been through worse than Catherine Whitmore, have we? We survived Mom dying. We survived being poor. We survived moving here and starting over with nothing. Emma squeezed his hands. We can survive you doing the right thing. Marcus felt something break open inside him, some wall he'd built around his fear and guilt. Emma was right. They'd survived worse. Not comfortably, not easily, but they'd survived with their humanity intact. This past year of comfort and security had cost them something more valuable than money could ever buy. It had cost them their integrity, their sense of who they were. I'll call the SEC investigator in the morning, Marcus said. I'll tell him I'll cooperate. Emma threw her arms around him, holding tight. Mom would be proud of you. I doubt that, sweetheart. I think she'd be disappointed it took me this long to remember what she taught me. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the small kitchen of an apartment they probably wouldn't be able to afford much longer. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to their drama, to the small tragedy of a man learning too late that some prices are too high to pay. Later that night, after Emma had gone to bed, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his phone in front of him. He should call James Bolton, the SEC investigator, tell him that he was ready to cooperate. But first, he needed to call Catherine. He owed her that much at least. A warning that her most valuable asset was about to become her biggest liability. She answered on the first ring. Have you made a decision? I'm going to cooperate with the investigation, Marcus said. I'm going to tell them everything. The silence that followed was long and heavy. When Catherine finally spoke, her voice was colder than he'd ever heard it. You're making a mistake, Marcus. A very expensive mistake, probably. But it's my mistake to make. Think about Emma. Think about what happens when I pull funding for your mother's facility. Think about what happens when I make sure you never work anywhere again. I have connections, Marcus. I can make your life unbearable. You already have. The truth of it surprised him. I've been miserable for months. I've been someone I don't recognize, someone my wife would have been ashamed of. You didn't give me a better life, Catherine. You just gave me a more comfortable prison. Spare me the philosophical revelation, she snapped. You're betraying me because you got caught. Don't dress it up as some moral awakening. Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm just a coward who only found his conscience when facing prison time. But at least I'm finding it. That's more than you've ever done. I gave you everything, Catherine said. And for the first time, he heard emotion in her voice. Real anger, real hurt. I pulled you out of poverty. I gave you dignity, purpose, Security. And this is how you repay me? You didn't give me dignity, Marcus said quietly. You paid me to compromise every value I had. You turned me into your weapon, and you're angry that the weapon is refusing to fire anymore. But I'm not a weapon, Catherine. I'm a person, and I'm done being yours. He hung up before she could respond. His hands were shaking, his heart racing, but he felt lighter than he had in months. It was done. The bridge was burned. There was no going back now. Marcus pulled up James Bolton's number and stared at it for a long moment. This call would change everything. It would mean cooperating with federal investigators, testifying before a grand jury, potentially appearing in court. It would mean publicly admitting his crimes, facing judgment, accepting consequences. It would mean the end of the comfortable life he'd built on compromised principle. But it would also mean the beginning of something else. A chance to rebuild his integrity. A chance to show Emma that it was never too late to do the right thing, even when it cost everything. A chance to become again the kind of man his wife would have been proud to call her husband. Marcus hit the call button. Bolton answered immediately, as if he'd been waiting. Mr. Bolton, this is Marcus Chun. I'm ready to talk. I'm glad to hear that, Mr. Chun. Very glad. When can you come in? Tomorrow morning. Early, I want to get this started. 9 o'clock, Federal Building, downtown. Ask for me at security. I'll be there. Marcus paused, then added, I want immunity for my testimony. Complete immunity. I'll tell you everything, but I need to know my daughter will be taken care of if something happens to me. We can work that out. The prosecutor will want to talk to you first, assess what you know, but if your information is as valuable as we think it is, immunity shouldn't be a problem. After he hung up, Marcus sat in the quiet kitchen and thought about tomorrow. About walking into a federal building and confessing his crimes. About betraying Catherine Whitmore, a woman who'd given him everything and taken even more. About facing whatever consequences came from his choices. It would be hard, it would be painful. It would probably destroy what remained of his comfortable life, but for the first time in months, Marcus Chun felt like himself again. Not the desperate janitor who'd accepted dirty money, not the corporate spy who'd sold his integrity, just a man trying to do right by his daughter in the memory of the woman they both loved. He pulled out a photo from his wallet, one of the few pictures he had of Sarah. She was smiling in it, that brilliant, incandescent smile that had first made him fall in love with her. He looked at her face and whispered, I'm sorry I forgot, but I remember now. Single quotes. Tomorrow he would begin the long process of making amends. Tonight, he would sleep better than he had in months, even knowing what the morning would bring. The federal building was everything Marcus had imagined it would be. Cold, imposing, built from gray stone that seemed designed to intimidate. He walked through the metal detectors at 9 in the morning with Emma beside him. She'd insisted on coming, had woken up early and dressed in her best clothes. A silent show of support that meant more to Marcus than any words could have. James Bolton met them in the lobby, looking crisp and professional in his dark suit. He shook Marcus's hand, then Emma's, treating her with a respect that surprised and pleased Marcus. Thank you for coming, Mr. Chun. We have a conference room set up on the 4th floor. My daughter stays with me, Marcus said. Whatever you need to discuss, she can hear it. Bolton glanced at Emma, then nodded. That's fine. She should probably hear this anyway. The conference room was windowless and sterile, dominated by a large table where 3 other people sat. Bolton introduced them. Sarah Kaufman, the assistant U.S. attorney who would be prosecuting the case. Michael Torres, an SEC enforcement attorney. And a woman named Linda Park, who was apparently a forensic accountant. They all had the same look. Sharp and intelligent and completely unimpressed by anything Marcus might say. Let's start at the beginning, Kaufman said once everyone was seated. She was in her 40s with short gray hair and eyes that had seen every kind of lie. How did Catherine Whitmore recruit you? Marcus told them everything. The conference room confrontation, the midnight meeting in the basement, the offer of $200,000 in exchange for corporate espionage. He described the non-disclosure agreement, the encrypted phone, the systematic gathering of intelligence on board members and executives. He told them about Gerald Whitmore's emails, about David Parks's conspiracy, about all the secrets he'd uncovered and weaponized at Catherine's direction. The attorneys took notes, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just listening. Emma sat beside him, her hand in his, offering silent support as he confessed to months of illegal activity. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Do you still have access to the encrypted phone? Torres asked. Yes. Catherine doesn't know I'm here. As far as she's concerned, I might still be deciding what to do. We need that phone. We need access to all the files you uploaded. All the communications between you and Whitmore. Can you get us that? Yes. Kaufman leaned forward. Mr. Chun, I want to be clear about what cooperation means. It means you testify before a grand jury. It means you give us everything, not just about Whitmore, but about everyone involved in this conspiracy. It means you may have to testify in open court, subject to cross-examination by very expensive defense attorneys who will do everything they can to destroy your credibility. I understand. It also means that some of the people you inform on may face serious consequence. Prison time, potentially. Are you prepared for that? Marcus thought about David Park, who'd conspired to destroy his own company, about Jonathan Webb, who'd stolen and cheated, about all the executives whose crimes he'd documented. They made their choices. I'm not responsible for the consequences of their actions. Good answer. Kaufman pulled out a document. This is an immunity agreement. It protects you from prosecution for any crimes related to your work for Catherine Whitmore in exchange for your full cooperation. Read it carefully before you sign. Marcus read through the dense legal length. It was comprehensive, covering everything from computer fraud to conspiracy to wiretapping. It also bound him to truthfulness, made clear that any lies or omissions would void the agreement and expose him to prosecution. It was a lifeline and a leash, offering freedom in exchange for complete honesty. He signed it. Emma watched him write his name, her expressions solemn and proud. The next 3 weeks were a blur of depositions, document reviews, and preparation for grand jury testimony. Marcus spent his days in that windowless conference room, going through every file he'd gathered, every conversation he'd had with Catherine, every crime he'd committed at her direction. The attorneys were thorough to the point of obsession, making him repeat stories multiple times to check for inconsistencies, pushing him on details he'd half forgotten. At Whitmore Financial, word spread quickly that Marcus was cooperating. He didn't return to work, which was probably wise since Catherine's rage was apparently spectacular. According to Bolton, who kept Marcus updated on the investigation's progress, she'd fired 3 executives she suspected of disloyalty, hired a team of lawyers that cost more per hour than Marcus used to make in a week, and was fighting the investigation with every resource at her disposal. She's claiming you're a disgruntled employee making up stories for immunity, Bolton told Marcus during one of their meetings. Her lawyers are going to argue entrapment, that she never explicitly ordered you to break the law, that you acted independently. She's smart, Marcus acknowledged. She was always careful about what she put in writing. Most of our conversations were in person, no recording, no witnesses. That's why your testimony is so important. You can establish intent, show that she knew what she was asking you to do was illegal. The jury needs to hear from someone who was there, who saw behind the corporate facade. The grand jury testimony happened on a cold morning in March. Marcus sat in a room full of ordinary citizens, people who'd been pulled from their normal lives to decide whether Catherine Whitmore should face criminal charges. He told his story again, answered questions, faced the skeptical looks of people trying to understand how someone could compromise themselves so completely for money. When one juror, an older woman, asked why he'd done it, Marcus gave her the truth. Because I was desperate. Because I have a daughter who needed medicine and a mother who needed care. Because someone offered me a way out of poverty and I took it without thinking about the cost. I made terrible choices. I knew they were terrible even as I was making them, but I made them anyway. Do you regret it? The woman asked. Marcus thought about the apartment they'd already lost, about the downgrade back to a smaller place in a worse neighborhood. He thought about his mother, moved to a less expensive facility because they couldn't afford the nice one anymore. He thought about Emma, who'd had to give up debate team because they needed to cut expenses. He thought about all the ways his confession had made their lives harder. Yes, he said, I regret it deeply. Not because I got caught, but because I became someone my daughter couldn't be proud of. I betrayed my own values, and no amount of money was worth that. The grand jury indicted Catherine Whitmore on 14 counts of conspiracy, securities fraud, obstruction of justice, and illegal wiretapping. The indictment was sealed initially, but news leaked within hours. The financial press had a field day. Catherine Whitmore, Billionaire CEO, facing decades in prison. Whitmore Financial stock price crashed. Board members resigned. Investors pulled out. The empire Catherine had built began to crumble. Marcus watched it happen from the safety of his small apartment, feeling a mixture of vindication and guilt. He'd helped destroy her. She'd helped destroy him first, had turned him into something he despised, but that didn't make the destruction any easier to witness. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of justice served, just a grim acknowledgement that they'd both lost, that the war had left nothing but casualties. Emma handled it better than Marcus did. She went to school, did her homework, helped with household chores, and never once complained about their reduced circumstance. She'd made friends on the debate team before they'd had to drop out, and those friends stayed loyal even after word spread about what her father had done. Good kids with good parents who understood that children weren't responsible for their parents' mistakes. One Saturday afternoon, Emma found Marcus sitting on the couch, staring at nothing. She sat beside him, leaning against his shoulder. You did the right thing, Dad. Did I? Catherine's company is collapsing. Thousands of people are going to lose their jobs. Innocent people who had nothing to do with any of this. Those jobs were built on crime, on secrets and blackmail and corruption. Maybe they would have collapsed anyway. At least this way the truth came out. The truth doesn't pay anyone's mortgage. No, Emma agreed. But lies don't either. Not in the long run. You told me Mom used to say that the truth might hurt, but lies hurt worse because they never stop hurting. Marcus pulled his daughter closer, grateful for her wisdom, for her strength, for her absolute unwavering belief that integrity mattered more than comfort. She was right. Sarah had said that, had lived it, had taught both of them that who you were mattered more than what you had. I have to testify in court next month, Marcus said. The trial is to start. It's going to be hard, baby. Catherine's lawyers are going to try to make me look like a liar and a criminal. They're going to dig into our lives, try to find things to discredit. Let them try. We have nothing to hide anymore. I'm scared. Me too. Emma squeezed his hand, but we'll get through it. We always do. The trial of Catherine Whitmore began on a Monday in April. The courthouse was packed with reporters, protesters, curious spectators. and financial industry professionals watching one of their own face judgment. Catherine sat at the defense table looking every inch the powerful CEO, dressed in an impeccable suit, her expression calm and confident. Her legal team surrounded her like guards, 5 lawyers who probably cost more collectively than most people made in a lifetime. Marcus was the prosecution's star witness. He took the stand on the 3rd day of trial, swore to tell the truth, and faced the jury. For 5 hours, he answered questions from Sarah Kaufman, walking through his recruitment, his crimes, Catherine's direction and knowledge. He explained how the espionage operation had worked, how they'd communicated, how she'd used the intelligence he gathered. Then came the cross-examination. Catherine's lead attorney was a man named Harrison Pierce, famous for his aggressive tactics and his ability to shred witnesses. He spent 2 days attacking Marcus's credibility, pointing out his criminal record, his financial motivations, his decision to cooperate only after being caught. "You're a confessed felon, aren't you, Mr. Chun?" Pierce asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "Yes, you committed crimes for money. Yes, and now you're testifying against my client in exchange for immunity, getting away with your crimes by blaming someone else." "I'm taking responsibility for my crimes," Marcus corrected, "and I'm telling the truth about who directed me to commit them." "The truth," Pierce smiled coldly. "Or a convenient story designed to save your own skin?" "The truth," Marcus said firmly. "I have nothing to gain from lying anymore. I've already lost everything that mattered except my daughter and my integrity. I won't lose those too." It went on like that, Pierce attacking from every angle, trying to find a crack in Marcus's testimony. But Marcus had learned something during his months of compromise. He'd learned that the truth, once you committed to it fully, was unshakable. He didn't have to remember which lies he'd told or keep his story straight. He just had to tell what happened simply and honestly and let the jury decide. When he finally stepped down from the witness stand, Marcus felt emptied out, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. But he also felt clean, as if he'd scrubbed away months of accumulated shame with simple honesty. The jury deliberated for 6 days. Marcus tried to go about his life normally during that time, but it was impossible to focus on anything else. The trial had consumed him, and now he waited for the verdict that would determine Catherine Whitmore's fate, and in some ways validate or invalidate his choice to cooperate. Emma was patient with his distraction, his inability to sleep, his constant checking of his phone for news. She made dinner when he forgot to eat, reminded him to shower when he spent too long sitting on the couch staring at nothing, and never once complained about the anxiety that had turned their small apartment into a pressure cooker. On the 6th day, James Bolton called. The jury's reached a verdict. They're reading it in an hour. Marcus and Emma took the subway to the courthouse. They sat in the back row of the gallery, trying to be invisible among the crowd of reporters and spectators. Catherine was already at the defense table, her expression unreadable. When her eyes swept across the courtroom and landed on Marcus, something flickered across her face. Not quite hate, not quite understanding. Something more complicated. The look of someone seeing their own reflection in a distorted mirror. The jury filed in. 12 ordinary people who'd spent weeks listening to testimony about corporate espionage, financial fraud, and the corruption that festered in the highest levels of business. The foreperson, a middle-aged man in a blue suit, stood when the judge asked for the verdict. "On the count of conspiracy, we find the defendant guilty." Catherine's expression didn't change, but Marcus saw her lawyer's hand grip her arm. "On the count of securities fraud, we find the defendant guilty." Each count was read, 14 in total, and for each one the answer was the same: guilty, guilty, guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom like a bell tolling, marking the end of Catherine Whitmore's empire, the collapse of everything she'd built through manipulation and fear. When the final verdict was read, Catherine stood. For a moment, Marcus thought she might say something, might offer some final defiant statement, but she simply nodded to her lawyers, accepted the handcuffs the bailiff placed on her wrists, and walked out of the courtroom with her head held high. Even in defeat, she refused to be diminished. Outside the courthouse, Emma hugged Marcus tight. "It's over," she whispered. "Yes," Marcus said. "It's over." But it wasn't. Not really. The trial was over, but the consequences rippled outward like waves from a stone thrown in still water. Whitmore Financial declared bankruptcy within a month. 3,000 employees lost their jobs. Shareholders lost billions. Pension funds that had invested heavily in the company saw their assets evaporate. The destruction was comprehensive and devastating. Marcus watched it happen with a heavy heart. He'd told himself he was exposing corruption, that bringing criminals to justice was worth the cost. But seeing the actual human toll made him wonder if he'd just traded one kind of destruction for another. Catherine had harmed people through her crimes, yes, but his testimony had harmed people too. Different people, innocent people, but harmed nonetheless. Catherine was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, had no sympathy for a billionaire who'd abused her position and corrupted her company. "You had every advantage," the judge said during sentencing. "Wealth, education, opportunity. You could have built an empire on integrity. Instead, you built one on fear and exploitation. Now you'll have time to reflect on those choices." Marcus didn't attend the sentencing. He'd said his piece in testimony. He didn't need to watch Catherine be led away in chains to feel vindicated. There was no vindication in any of this. Just loss compounded by more loss. He found work at a different building, a different company, back to being just a janitor. The pay was standard, $35,000 a year, barely enough to cover rent and expenses. But it was honest work, and Marcus discovered he valued that more than he'd ever valued the money Catherine had paid him. He pushed his cart, emptied trash cans, cleaned offices, and for the first time in over a year, he felt like himself. Emma thrived despite everything. Or maybe because of everything. She'd learned young that life was hard, that people made mistakes, that integrity mattered more than comfort. She rejoined the debate team when a teacher offered to cover her fees. She made honor roll. She started volunteering at a community center, helping younger kids with homework. She became the kind of person Sarah would have been proud of, kind of person Marcus was learning to be again. 1 year after Catherine's conviction, Marcus received a letter. It came from the federal prison in Connecticut where Catherine was serving her sentence. He almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of him. He opened it carefully, half expecting recriminations or threats. The letter was short, written in Catherine's precise handwriting on prison stationery. Marcus, it began, I'm not writing to forgive you or ask for forgiveness. I'm writing because I've had a lot of time to think about what happened, about the choices we both made. You asked me once what you were to me. I told you that you were my most valuable asset. I was wrong. You were my mirror showing me who I'd become. Someone who saw people as tools, who measured worth and utility, who confused power with purpose. I hated what I saw in that mirror, so I smashed it. That's what the trial was really about. Not justice, not corruption, but my refusal to face what you reflected back at me. You did destroy me, Marcus, but I'd already destroyed myself long before we met. You just made it visible. I don't know if that counts as wisdom or just prison philosophy. Either way, I thought you should know. Catherine, Marcus read the letter 3 times. He thought about writing back, but decided against it. There was nothing left to say. They'd both been broken people who'd broken each other further. Maybe Catherine would find redemption in prison. Maybe she wouldn't. That was her journey now, not his. His journey led elsewhere. On a Tuesday evening, Marcus was cleaning an empty conference room when he overheard a conversation in the hallway. 2 executives arguing about a financial decision, one of them pushing for a strategy that Marcus recognized as dangerously over-levered, the kind of aggressive expansion that looked good on paper but could destroy a company if markets turned. The old Marcus, the corporate spy, would have gathered intelligence and reported it to someone who could use it. The older Marcus, the invisible janitor, would have ignored it entirely. But this Marcus, the one who'd learned that silence in the face of wrong was its own kind of corruption, did something different. He stepped into the hallway. "Excuse me," he said to the executives, who looked at him with the typical mixture of surprise and dismissal that people reserve for service workers who dared to speak. "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation. I'm not an expert, but that expansion strategy you're discussing, it's the same one that destroyed Whitmore Financial. I worked there. I saw it happen. Just thought you might want to know." The executives stared at him. One of them, a younger woman with sharp eyes, asked, "What do you mean it destroyed Whitmore Financial?" Marcus explained briefly and without technical jargon how over-leveraging in pursuit of growth had left Catherine's company vulnerable when one acquisition failed, how the debt spiral had started, how the desperation to hide losses had led to fraud, how the whole house of cards had eventually collapsed. When he finished, the executives looked at each other. The woman pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the CFO. We need to revisit this proposal." She looked at Marcus. "Thank you. What's your name?" "Marcus Chun. I'm just the janitor." "Well, Marcus Chun, the janitor, you might have just saved this company a very expensive mistake." She smiled, genuine warmth in it. "Thank you for speaking up." Marcus went back to his cleaning cart, but he felt lighter somehow. He'd spoken truth to power again. But this time as a warning rather than an indictment. This time without compromise or hidden agenda. This time as simply a man who'd learned hard lessons and wanted to help someone else avoid them. That night he told Emma about the encounter. She listened, then smiled. "Mom always said the best teaching comes from making mistakes and being honest about them." "You're teaching, Dad, just in a different way than you expected." Marcus thought about that as he lay on his pull-out couch that night, in the small apartment with the water-stained ceiling, back where he'd started, but somehow different. He thought about Catherine in her prison cell, about Gerald Whitmore dying in his hospital bed, about David Park serving his sentence, about all the lives that had been destroyed by the pursuit of power and money at any cost. And he thought about himself, about the journey from poverty to wealth and back to poverty again, about the man he'd been and the man he was becoming. He'd learned that financial security built on compromise principles was no security at all, that wealth without integrity was just another form of poverty, that the most valuable things in life, the things worth holding on to, couldn't be bought or sold or stolen. They could only be earned through difficult choices and honest living. Emma was asleep in the bedroom, safe and loved and learning to navigate a complicated world with grace and strength. His mother was in a facility he could barely afford, but she was cared for, and on her good days she still smiled. He had honest work, a clear conscience, and the knowledge that he'd finally done the right thing, even when it cost him everything. It wasn't the ending Marcus would have chosen a year ago, but it was the ending he needed. The ending he'd earn. And lying there in the darkness, listening to the city's night sounds filtering through the thin walls, Marcus Chun felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt at peace,